Party has tracked their quarry to a narrow fissure in the northern Barrier Mountains. They are in the town of Oil Grove, a settlement on the fringes of the Shalazian Empire. Squeezing through the cave entrance, the seven of them find themselves in a silent, pitch-black cave. Yondar, the human druid, ignites a torch. Illuminated before them is a maze of webs. A dozen spiders the size of tarantulas skitter out of view. Sweeping the room, they press onwards. As they funnel deeper still into the cavern, Leonid, the gnome bard, turns to suddenly see two spiders the size of wolves descending from deep crevasses in the ceiling. In a desperate struggle, the party finds themselves wedged into a narrow cave, fighting an onslaught of venomous fangs. Leonid is gravely wounded by a spider as its fangs pierce through his leather armor, paralyzing him. Voth and Bran, the two rogues, rescue Leonid by fighting valiantly. Deeper inside the cavern, Yakimura, the human samurai, slays another large spider as it attempts to sink its fangs into Yondar, emerging suddenly from a trapdoor in the wall. Parthenax, the dragon-born eldritch knight, stumbles upon a room where the preserved remains of several captured villagers have been drained of their blood. One is still alive, a desperate hermit named Osnius. In the deepest portion of the cave, the party stumbles across an obsidian pillar, seemingly having grown out of the floor. Inlaid into the pillar are several carved pieces of obsidian, bearing the mark of Lolth. Gathering up the obsidian pieces, the party returns to Oil Grove, receiving a signature of a job well done. The party agrees to another contract, escorting a shipment of valuable oil berries to the capital of Shalaz. And thus ends the first session of the Thronebreakers campaign. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to the campaign diary. So what you've just heard is just a narrative summary of what happened across about 4 hours of a session that I ran. This is actually a couple weeks ago, but I'm just making a video about it now because I felt like it. So in this portion of the video, I'm going to talk about my thoughts as a dungeon master on the session, and especially the strategies that I used or tried to use and how they turned out, and things like improvements or my thoughts on if you are going to use any of this sort of stuff, how it could be improved. So this was the first session of the campaign, which in my experience is going to be very different in terms of the vibe, but also the structure from almost any other session that you're going to be running throughout. If so, across the whole campaign, I would kind of separate into, you get your first session, you get the whole every other session, then you got the last session. There's like 3 different types of sessions, generally speaking. And so my go-to strategy for starting a campaign, since I started playing Dungeons and Dragons, has always been to start with the party having received a contract. Like they've already gotten the contract, and I got this from the starter set in the Mines of Phandelver, where the adventurers begin already on the road to Phandelver with the dwarf, I forget his name, but they're traveling with the dwarf to get to Phandelver. And I think that that's my favorite way to start campaigns. Starting in a tavern, the kind of cliche, people talk about it a lot. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it, but I think that sort of experience would probably be better off for experienced players, and especially experienced role players, because you can have experienced players that don't really get into role playing, which is fine. Because starting in the tavern requires that player-to-player role playing, which I think is a lot more uncomfortable and difficult for the party to do, especially just starting out. It's a lot easier for the DM to player, because when you're doing DM to player, the DM is very clearly role playing, and I think it's easier for the player to get into it. Whereas player to player, it can kind of like, wait, are we just talking about what we're doing as like, wait, am I me and you're you, or are you Parthenax and I'm Yaki? It kind of gets confusing, and I think players also get nervous about it. So that's why I start in what you'd say, I think in media res would be the term when it's used in film. But a particular kind of difference that I did, a different strategy I took, is I took Matt Colville's idea of Orcs Attack, which he describes in one of his videos, which I'll link down below, which is starting in like the thick of battle. So I actually started not just with the party having gotten the contract, but actually going into the dungeon. I didn't start with them trying to track the monster back to the cave. I just started with them already having tracked it, especially because I didn't have a ranger. If I had a ranger, I would definitely do that differently because that's their whole thing. But I didn't have a ranger, so I was like, okay, I don't need to have this whole mystery tracking event. And yeah, so I start there, and that gave Matt Colville talks a lot about the narrative and the drama and things like that, but just on like a functional level, this gave me a lot of advantages that made the session more fun for me, and I think more fun for the players than as the alternative, which would have been starting in a tavern or starting having just gotten the contract and having to go and find the monsters themselves. And the advantages that gave to me were that I was able to just prepare very specifically for this session, especially because I hadn't DM'd in a couple months. As you're nervous, it's a lot easier to just have this clear goal. Okay, I need to make this dungeon. I need to make sure it's fair. I need to make sure it's fun. And I just got to make this dungeon. I don't have to worry about yet. I don't have to worry about the party, running off and doing something that I don't expect, which is fun. That's where some of the best memories of a campaign are going to come from. But for the first session, I like I really like just starting with them already in the action. And this is the first time I did it, but I think I'm probably going to do it almost by default from now on. So that was the advantages for me were being able to prepare. Now, a lot of people would say this is very railroady. I'm forcing the players to go into the fight in this dungeon. And that's very true, but like I said, the first session is very, very different from what else you're going to be doing in the campaign. I mean, the players had not been playing up until this point, so I'm railroading them, but they weren't playing, so it's not like I'm taking away the agency because we never played before. So I think that for the first session, something like this is okay. I don't know if I would always do it. I don't know how often I'm going to do it throughout the campaign, skipping like these kind of build up, but starting in the action was really useful here for this first session. So now I somewhat simplified the spider cave in my narrative, which is only about 2 minutes long, so of course I simplified it quite a bit. But in reality, it was a lot longer, and there were a lot more spiders than what you guys saw, or what you guys heard about. So I'll provide a scan of the dungeon map below. It was about like 5 rooms, and each room had some sort of encounter, either traps or more spiders or something like that, and it ended with them fighting the kind of queen spider. And there were a couple things that I did here that I liked. One thing I did is, so I used traps, like a trapdoor spider. So there were fake rocks that if the party stepped on them, they would collapse and they would fall into like a pit. And there would be spiders in there that would start nibbling at them. And something I did differently here, which I don't know if I'll do all the time, but I did here, is I actually drew out these larger rocks on the map. And so the players, when they would move and they moved over one, I would have it fall and they would go in. So they quickly realized, okay, we need to look on the map and recognize, okay, we can't go there. There's probably a trap there. Now, not every single one was trapped necessarily, but that gave the party something to kind of do in a meta sense, and it was a good sort of meta. Like, they felt like they were recognizing these traps and they were able to plan around it. And it's something that the characters would do anyway. So that was an advantage. I was able to really leverage using this map to help the players kind of get into what was happening and get into where their characters are and what their characters are doing. So the primary enemies for this were, as you can probably guess, giant spiders. And giant spiders are really interesting. They are not as simple as you would think. And that's mainly comes from their poison. They have a venom that they have. And so when a spider attacks, they do, the standard damage, and they do poison damage. So they're pretty heavy hitters. They do one attack, though. They can also shoot a web. the web isn't super useful because they're giving up their action, and the player is probably just going to bust out. So unless you have multiple spiders, like a lot of spiders, then the webs are probably not going to be super useful. The webs I would more so see happening when after the spider knocks somebody unconscious, they web them and drag them away. It's more of like a dramatic ability rather than a actually particularly threatening one. At least in my experience running them here, every time I used the web, it was just like, well, there goes its action, and it didn't really do much. But so giant spiders, what makes them interesting is their venom. If they knock the player unconscious or the target unconscious, the player is paralyzed for an hour, poisoned and paralyzed for an hour, even if they get revived, which is fairly, I don't think it's that common in the monster manual for there to be this effect. And there's no saving throws. That's really what makes it unique. Not unique, but interesting, is that there's no saving throw after you fall unconscious. So if you fall unconscious, then you are paralyzed for an hour. Even if your party heals you up to full health, you're still stuck there for an hour. And that can make the fights very kind of swingy because a lot of the spider's power is locked up in knocking somebody unconscious. So they actually kind of counter, if you're ever interested, if you have a party that does this, they kind of counter the kind of healing word, get you back up on like 2 health kind of play style. Because it doesn't really matter. And that's what happened. And it did irritate the players because they didn't believe me that this was how it worked. They were or at least one of them was convinced I was making a mistake, that they must be that they save. And now this is a whole other thing, but this is when you have players who are also DMs. They think that they know the rules and they're gonna kind of be a little bit meta. But you just got to stand your ground and be like, well, it doesn't even matter what the monster manual says. This is my campaign. It's my giant spider. It can do whatever it wants. You just got to stand your ground, and usually they'll be fine with it. They're just really trying to, I think this player was really just trying to be helpful and help me out, but it was in this case I didn't necessarily need it. So thankfully, what saved the party is they had Churbs, the paladin, who has Lay on Hands, which he can use to cure poison, which by extension cures the paralysis. So that was really the saving grace of the party. Is I think 2 or 3 people ended up getting knocked down by these spiders. Leonid had it particularly bad. That's why he's mentioned explicitly in the narrative. He got surrounded by 2 giant spiders and was paralyzed, and the other party had to come in and rescue him and fight him off. But Churbs was able to cure the paralysis, which was a great moment for his character. And it's interesting because he's actually a vengeance paladin. And having these kind of his healing ended up being his kind of biggest thing. But anyway, for this session. And then they finally fought a massive Spider Queen, which was CR4. So it was a tough fight. Actually, no, it was CR3. It was CR3, but it used the CR3 stats that are in like the Dungeon Master's Guide, which are insane. If you actually run a monster like that, if you just use the quick stat blocks, they're insane. They have so much health and so little AC. You're meant to mess with it a little bit, but I just took that and basically just turned it into a monster, and the party paid no notice. I gave them a bunch of web shooting abilities to make the web shooting a little bit more useful. But that was just a quick homebrewed monster. And then there were a bunch of minions, which are just the tiny spiders that were helping out their mom there. It was a tough fight, but the party was able to pull through. And I think I got the balance just right. It's just right. I used Xanathar's Guide, the Xanathar's Guide balancing for encounters, and it was just right. The party was pushed, but they were able to recover, and they were panicked, but they were able to come through, and I think they felt heroic when they finally were able to do it. Were able to beat this Spider Queen, especially because Voth Teleth, the rogue, made a sneak attack that did like 26 or 7 damage. It's like no, it wasn't a critical hit, but it was a big hit, and it was a really breathtaking moment for sure. So yeah, that's the description of the dungeon in short. But finally, on a final note, so for this campaign, I have 7 players, which is the most that I've run for a consistent group. I've run or participated in sessions that are up to 10 players, but that's just one time for people who are curious about what Dungeons and Dragons is. For 7 players showing up regularly, it'll be somewhat challenging. We started at level 3. The reason that I chose to have the party start at level 3 is because level 1 and 2 are kind of boring. By level 3, no matter what class you pick, you've already picked a subclass, and it's more, I think, narratively, it's a good place to start. Now, level 1 is classic to start there, so I'm not saying don't start level 1, but from where most of my party was experienced, level 3, I think, was where they preferred to begin. And that let me get to monsters that I wanted to run earlier on, so it was helpful for me. And then we had a session 0, so that was useful for the 3 players who were kind of brand new. So having the session 0 let them get familiar with the game, with their characters. So I would definitely recommend having session 0s for any campaign you're going to start. You're going to have a session 0 and a session 1. So I guess going back to the 3 different types of sessions, there's going to be the 4th type. The 4th type, I can't really keep my finger up for some reason. But the 4th type, which is going to be the session 0. Which is a whole other thing. There's lots of great videos out there, I'm sure, about that. But, and for those new players, another advantage of starting the dungeon, getting back to that, is that for the players starting in the dungeon, D&D in the dungeon is more like a video game than it's an easier coming in place for a new player who's familiar with video games, because you've got all these very clear actions. It's very similar to World of Warcraft. I haven't never actually played WoW, but it looks like you got the toolbar. It's like Diablo. It's like all these other games that many players would be familiar with. You're doing your abilities in combat. You're casting spells. You've got this whole list of abilities, and that's because if you look at when you're making that character in session 0, like, for most classes, like 80% of your abilities are going to be combat related. It's going to say take an action, which is something that you only really do in combat. So they're all like combat related. So giving the players that chance to really, really cut their teeth and use these abilities early on, I think was helpful, especially for the new players, but also for experienced players who are playing a new class, a new subclass. They've trying this crazy build. They want to experience what their character is meant to do, which is usually meant to be in combat. Very few people are power building a social character. It doesn't really happen. So I think it's a great way to start for that reason as well. It wasn't until the party finds the hermit that they have a social role playing, the chance at social role playing. And I think that was an easy coming in place. They were already fighting all these spiders, so they didn't have to worry too much about. They were just going to rescue this guy, and they talked to him a little bit, and that just introduces the idea that, okay, this is another thing that we do in Dungeons and Dragons, is we talk to NPCs, and NPCs can be complicated. His name was Osnius. Osnius, the hermit, is a complicated character. He's originally in exile. He was exiled from Shalaz. And so they find him, and he's been exiled for like 30 years. And so he's a little bit crazy, and he's a little bit conspiratorial, and he's kind of weird. So he kind of lets them see like a kind of, not a complex character, or a character that's motives are not entirely clear to the party immediately. And he's not just there. Their quest wasn't to save him. He's a complication, really, that they find. And then they get a little bit more when at the end they talk to the administrator, which is Avanok, the administrator of like the town, who signs their contract, or signs to say that they completed the quest. And that gives them a little bit more. But these were really the main 2 characters they interacted with in depth. They also talked, like, had offhand, like, just little quick moments with villagers that they encountered as they went back to town. But those were the 2 that they really interacted with, and it was pretty simple. I didn't try and get super complicated. It's pretty clear. Avanok gives them a new quest, and that goes into the final advantage of I think of starting a campaign like this, is that it leaves you at a very good place to end if you start with one of these small dungeons in a quest to go through the dungeon. The players have gone through the dungeon, they're out, they did the quest, and that's where we can end the session. I gave them the hook for the next session, which would be, if they chose to escort this caravan back to the capital, and they did end up taking it. But anyway, like, just they gave us a great point to end. After I think it's 4.5 or 5 hours that we were there. It's just a great place to just say, okay, we're gonna call it there, and it's not like we're cutting ourselves off, or it's not like we're cutting ourselves off and we're just getting started on something, or we're not even able to get into something. So that's something that I really try to do for my sessions now, more than I ever used to do. Is I try and get them to a point where they can end and the party feels satisfied with how it got, or they at least feel engaged. Because I don't like ending basically in the middle of something, because then the party comes back and then it's easier to get lost as to what was happening. But anyway, so that's a bunch of thoughts basically on starting a campaign and how I started this campaign and the strategies that I used. And overall, I would have to recommend doing these sort of the orcs attack strategy and getting started right in the action, especially if you're in a party that is less experienced players, which is probably most parties. But yeah, that's my thoughts on that session, and thanks for watching very much, and have a wonderful day, all you folks.